Now, the first version of this video was actually taken down by YouTube after someone else complained about it. And I want to explain to you what happened.
So if we cover our competitor panel over here,
hang on.
you can see, we'll cover it.
Yep.
You can see that the generation drops straight away.
Right.
But my colleague over here is going to cover the Aiko panel in the exact same spot. And you'll see they'll continue.
I'm still skeptical.
I was surprised or basically excited to see there was a difference.
Aiko, I think you're full of garbage. There's a new panel on the Australian solar market and it's called Aiko Solar. And there's been a ridiculous amount of hype around this panel. So what is it that's been hyping up the solar industry? Well, it's this demo that they've been doing at trade shows all around the world that appears to prove that their panel works so much better when it's shaded. They appear to be claiming it's basically a shade-proof solar panel. So is this the final nail in the coffin for Enphase microinverters or SolarEdge optimizers, or the way that SMA and Fronius deal with shade? Well, let's find out. So Aiko started in the solar industry in 2009 making solar cells. So today they are one of the biggest manufacturers of solar cells in the world. It wasn't until 2018 that they made their first solar panels. And in 2022, they introduced their all-back contact cell, which is what we'll be talking about later. So Aiko only started selling their panel in Australia about, half an hour ago, like in early 2024. Well, that doesn't give me a lot of confidence for the way that they'll be here for the next 25 years to cover any warranty issues. But I'll tell you what does give me a little bit more confidence. They've hired some really good people from the Australian solar industry. So Thomas Bywater is their country manager. He was previously over at Jinko. And Ross Crawford came over from REC. So good leadership is a really good start, but it's going to take much more than that to get us to buy a good panel. You need the panel that stands out from all the other panels on the market. We need a compelling reason to buy Aiko rather than Jinko or Canadian or Trina. Well, at least according to Aiko's marketing team, Aiko have all of this with their new all-back contact cell. So this is what back contact means. Here's a traditional solar cell. When sunlight hits the silicon, the blue part on the back, it excites electrons which then travel down the fingers, these silver fingers here, and the bus bars that go up and down the panel. That's all actually made of silver. The traditional place to put all these silver bus bars and fingers is on the front of the panel. Now, obviously, these silver lines shade the front of the solar cell, so some manufacturers are using what they call all-back contact cells, or ABC cells. So SunPower have been doing this for years. This is their cell here, and Longi also do it. It not only improves the output of a panel, but it looks pretty schmicko. So here you have the front of the SunPower cell, and the back contact is on the back, something similar to what Aiko are doing. But Aiko are pushing the ABC cell even further, to a point where they are claiming at trade shows that it helps with shading. Now, let's look at how shading normally works on a solar panel. Solar panels are generally divided into 3 parts or 3 cell strings. Now, let's say this panel was producing 300 watts at the time. That would be 100 watts for each cell string. Now, let's say I start shading the panel. This much shade might reduce the output of the whole panel by, let's say, 20 watts, and a bit more might reduce it by 50 watts. But if you shade much more than that, then the cell string will be completely bypassed, and your panel will run at about 200 watts. However, Aiko claim that their panel works better than this.
This is our clever little experiment here. So we have the Aiko panel over there to our right.
Yes.
And then over here, what we have is a competitor panel.
Same wattage?
No, the Aiko panel, same dimensions, 470 watts.
Oh, yes.
This panel over here, 440.
Okay, so more watts out of the same footprint.
So what we're running DC from the panel down to these little pumps on the floor over here. And what we're going to show you is the shade optimization.
Oh, I love a demo. Show me.
So if we cover our competitor panel over here,
hang on.
you can see,
Yep.
we'll cover it.
Yep.
You can see that the generation drops straight away.
Right.
But my colleague over here is going to cover the Aiko panel in the exact same spot. And you'll see they'll continue.
So it just reduces the flow.
Yeah, but not
stops.
We can more or less cover the entire panel. And you will see the Aiko panel will continue to generate.
Oh, this is a great demo. I've never seen anyone do this before. Yeah, and you've got a little LED power strip showing the power production or the current.
You know what? I'm calling BS. Everything I know about how a string inverter works, the voltage, the current, the maximum power point trackers, it just does not make sense. In fact, I called up a mate, Ross, the bloke in that video, and I bet him a beer that the Aiko panel would not work better in the shade or significantly better in the shade in real-world conditions. So let's jump up into the roof and I'll show you the tests that I've been doing for the last fortnight.
Okay, so I'm up here on my warehouse roof in Brisbane, and I wanted to set up a demo that is more real world than that trade show demo that Ross was showing. So what we've got here is a string of 9 panels, which is our Aiko back contact panels, and I've done 9 Canadian 465s just in front of me, facing the same orientation. They get the same shade late in the afternoon from the arrays. So I've done this test many times with different panels. It's a fairly clean test. So first thing I thought we'll do the second test that Ross did, because it was kind of curious, is if we shade this much of a panel, how much we're going to lose. So currently, at the time of test, each panel was producing around about 300 watts. So the whole array was producing around about 2,700 watts, or this whole string. So if we shade this much, how much are we going to lose? Well, common sense would tell you that that's going to engage the bypass diode, and this cell is going to drop off. And that's what would happen on a traditional panel. So obviously I've done the same test down here, and that's what we would expect, is far too much shade. So instead of dragging the whole panel down or the whole string down, the bypass diode engages. And that's exactly what happened on both panels. So there was no advantage from Aiko here. Kind of made sense, and it's why I kind of thought this test was a bit of garbage. So then they did this test, and I thought, well, I think the same thing's going to happen here, but we are shading less of a cell string. So bypass diode just in this 1/3 portion of it, and maybe down here we're shading a little bit less enough that the bypass diode won't engage. I know that on a Canadian panel it will, but when we go back to our Aiko panel, we'll see what happens. And what would you think? Nah, unfortunately it failed again. So the bypass diode just engaged again. So we can see that when we're in our Fronius monitoring in the back end, we download all the data, but the voltage just drops by about 30 volts, and the power from the string, instead of 2,700, drops back to 2,400. Both systems are performing the same. So I thought, let's drop this down a little bit. Here's a bit of a common test that I do, is do shading of about this size. I always do this sort of test with N-phase and stuff, and I clamp it to the side of the panel. I really don't like the idea of putting it down there, so it's not a real test. So I'd clamp it to the side. Still, even this amount of shade, it was engaging. So I'm like, surely something's got to happen here. So we just put a real little bit of shade around about the size of, your iPhone or your wallet or something like that on each panel. And I thought, we'll see how that goes. This time, I was surprised or basically excited to see there was a difference. And Aiko, so let's say these strings are running at 2,700 watts. This one would have dropped down by around about 150 watts, and that one only lost 50 watts. So there was a big difference. The bypass diode engaged there, but it didn't on this one. So we did see a fairly remarkable difference there. 100 watts, I think, 2,000, let's say 2,500 versus 2,600 was a fair difference. So I thought, well, that's interesting, but that's just a very anecdotal, instantaneous test. So I started setting up my tests like I normally do. And this is a test I did obviously on both arrays. When I do that, I make sure the shade is identical. That's the reason I clip it to the panel rather than having a bollard. And basically, this is the amount of shade I put on both arrays. So this is going to shade it in the morning. That's going to throw shade from the morning sun. And this one will throw shade all day, just at different sort of amounts. And let's go down back to the green room and I'll explain to you the results. Now, Aiko really does have something going on here with the way they have precisely manufactured the fingers on the back of the contact panel, these little tiny bus bars. They're really close together, just helping the breakdown of resistance work a lot better. It's pretty impressive. Now, while it doesn't even work close to the way that Aiko demonstrated it in the trade show with that massive piece of cardboard, but to be fair, most of that increase in performance was seen between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., where in reality, your panels probably wouldn't be shaded anyway. Now, in fact, come to think of it, maybe warranty would be void if you shaded your panel at lunchtime. So let's look at what Aiko's install manual says. Wonder. So surprise, surprise, the install manual says that you have to avoid partial shading from tree and buildings, etc. Is that shade at 6 a.m. or is that shade at lunchtime that they're talking about? Well, it just doesn't say in the manual, so we'd have to leave it up to the bloke that is processing the warranty at the time. Technically, he could void it if it was shaded at 6 a.m. So this isn't a new problem. Check out this video here where I discuss about get out of jail clauses in install manuals.
Okay, it's been around about 6 or maybe 8 weeks since I was up on the roof because I wanted to continue my testing just to make sure it was accurate. I had some curveballs thrown at me. Now, the first thing I want to explain is that I did get the flash test data of each panel. Now, what this means is when you get a 465 watt panel, if you look on the spec sheet, you'll see, for example, Canadian says it can be plus or minus 5 watts. So it can be anywhere between 460 and 470 watts. The way they do that, they just put it in a chamber and at 25 degrees, flash 1,000 watts of artificial light on it and measure the output. That's what a flash test is. And these Canadian panels, when I got the results back, were performing just under 465. The Aiko panels have a positive tolerance, which is a win for them. Theoretically, they can go plus 3%, which means anywhere from 465 all the way up to near 479 or something like that. You're not going to get that. But anyway, they were just over 465 watts. There was a little bit of advantage there, so a 0.7% advantage with the Aiko panel. So let me know in the comments, but I leveled that just to make sure my figures weren't just giving Aiko an advantage because they were flashing higher, because I could have happened to get a Canadian that was flashing higher as well. The interesting part with that is when I ran them side by side, Aiko was actually performing 0.9% better. So I averaged that down to 0.2, minus a 0.7. And I said they're performing 0.2% better, which is basically nothing. And that's what I normally find from panels is if it's 465, like they perform effectively the same. What I found was really interesting though, is that the panels performed differently at different times of day. So the Canadian panel was performing better in low light up to about 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning. And, from 2 or 3 o'clock onwards, it would perform around about 50 watts or 20 watts or whatever it might be better in those shoulder hours of the day, where at lunchtime, the Aiko panel was performing up to 100 watts better. And that's over a 4 kilowatt array, 4 kilowatts of each panels around about. And it was performing around about 100 watts better in that time. But average it during the day, downloading the Fronius data from each string, and they perform basically the same. Aiko has theoretically 0.2% of an advantage. So I found that pretty interesting. I think in my understanding that is an advantage for Canadian solar, because when do you use most power? In the morning and the afternoon, when you're wanting that most of the power, when you're probably drawing power from the grid. But at lunchtime hours, you're probably sending power back to the grid, or you're probably clipping that power with your inverter, because let's say you have 13 kilowatts of panels on a 10 kilowatt inverter. In summertime, you're clipping that power off anyway. So the fact that Aiko works better at mid-lunchtime, I don't think is necessarily an advantage, but we're kind of clutching at straws here. Let's get on to shade. So I'm going to wind it back a bit, and I did a bunch of tests over the last 6 weeks, and one of them was to put a tiny bit of shade, and I used this Solar Cutter stickers. Thanks to Solar Cutters for sponsoring that sticker. And so I put 3 stickers on each array, so 6 stickers in total to see. This was supposed to, no offense, I just couldn't find a Solar Edge sticker, but this was supposed to simulate bird poo or something like that. And I found no difference on a little bit of shade like that, which I kind of found surprising. The next test I did was just to shade something like an A4 page over it. Now, and as you saw up on the roof, when we shade the Aiko panel and the Canadian panel, with too much shade, the bypass diode will engage and they both perform exactly the same. So Aiko has no advantage there when you get any reasonable amount of shade. Now, this is the interesting part, and this is where I think I lost the bet with you, Ross, that I owe you a beer, because we did find some advantage, as I was talking about, when we shaded it with, that wallet size, smaller than an iPhone amount of shade. And particularly when I put that core flute up and those clamps onto the panels, and I found a little bit of shade, which was bigger than the amount of a sticker, but smaller than the amount of an A4 page, or significantly smaller, around about that wallet size, had that kind of shade changing over the course of the day, and I found that Aiko worked around about 3 or maybe 4% better than Canadian, which I was really surprised about, and I think that's why, Ross wins in this case. But I haven't finished there. So what really annoys me about this marketing that Aiko are doing around the world is that it's deceiving us into thinking that this is working with massive amounts of shade. And I'm sure they know in the real world it doesn't happen like that. Now check out this clip. I've been watching different YouTubers rave on about this Aiko panel because it does sound fantastic. And a guy at Artesian Electrics called Jordan, I've been following his channel. It's a great channel. He did this little clip here.
We saw one demonstration where 2 panels were laid out side by side with the same amount of light shining on them. These panels were powering a water pump. Now the water pump would significantly reduce in power when one of the panels was shaded, but the other panel, when shaded, it had very little impact. With technology like this on the horizon, the question is, will optimizers and microinverters be made redundant because the solar panels have technology within them to protect from shading?
So you can see why I'd be annoyed is that he was fooled into thinking that this is a shade-proof panel, that it's going to do wonders in the shade. Because really, I think that's what their little demo with in the trade show shows you. What's even more annoying about that is SolarEdge and Enphase don't help you in the shade at all. And I've proven that. Check out this video. It's got to do with the MPP tracker in a Fronius inverter, that you don't need optimizers or microinverters if you're working in the shade. They can give you either work better or worse, depending on the situation. By the way, Enphase has stopped marketing their panels as shade solutions because it's complete garbage, and they know it. At least Enphase Australia has. This garbage that they're marketing and fooling quality, credible installers over thinking we've got a shade-proof panel really annoys me. Now, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about is they did this strength test too at the demo, where they were proving that their cells are stronger than the other. Now, do I believe that? Well, no, I think it's total garbage, probably because they completely overstated the advantages in the shade. But I want to test it myself, so I am going to, now that I've finished all my testing with them, I'm going to walk on 2 different panels with my boots on and then get my thermal camera out and see if one's better than the other. Now, the first version of this video was actually taken down by YouTube after someone else complained about it, and I want to explain to you what happened. So at the beginning of this video, I had that trade show demo with Glen Morris, and originally it was someone else's video that I used because, to be honest, I thought it was a more interesting short clip. But that person seems to still think that the Aiko panel will work somewhat like it did in the trade show. So they put a copyright strike out against me, which is fair because, I didn't ask them in the first place. I could have contested that copyright challenge under fair use, but, whatever. So I figured I'll leave it down, and I got Glen's snippet. Now, the other thing that happened while that video was up for a really short time is I got contacted by Aiko that said that my video was a grubby attack that they'll never forget, which is kind of a shame that it got like that. But I did challenge them, like I have in the past, and said, look, show me how to set up the test to get those results that you did in the trade show. Do I need a long string, a short string? Do I need microinverters, optimizers? Do I need, a different kind of inverter that I'm using? Originally, they were ignoring that, but when I asked them yesterday after they said, I had a grubby attack, their response was more that they believe that it wouldn't be worth their time because they think I'm disingenuous and would never want to show positive results of their panel anyway, which is kind of ironic because I did show some positive results of the panel. Anyway, here's my challenge to you, Aiko. If you can show another YouTuber, don't have to trust me, show someone else how to set up a test to make these panels work like they did in the trade show, but in the real world with a real string inverter, or microinverters or whatever it is, then I'll take this video down, I'll recant, I'll put up a video saying how I was wrong about Aiko.
But if you can't do that, then I suggest or challenge you to take your dodgy marketing down, because I believe you're misleading the market. You're misleading salespeople who are telling customers all over the market, all over the world, that these panels are actually doing something that they're really not doing. Anyway, Merry Christmas from Disneyland in Paris. I'll catch you next time.